Imagine this. It is the dead of night somewhere in the South Pacific Ocean. The year is 1942. American sailors are asleep in their bunks, completely unaware that less than 30 miles away, a Japanese fleet is cutting through the black water at 30 knots, loaded with shells, loaded with torpedoes, and loaded with the singular intention of wiping every American ship off the face of the earth before sunrise. By the time the alarms sound, it is already too late. Within minutes, 4 American cruisers are burning on the surface of the ocean. Men are screaming in water that is turning red. Admirals are dead. Ships are gone. And the battle has barely even started. This is not a story about American triumph. This is not a story about glory and honor and easy victories. This is the story of Guadalcanal, the most brutal, the most chaotic, the most terrifying naval campaign in the entire history of American warfare. A campaign that the United States came within inches of losing not once, not twice, but 7 separate times. 7 moments where the entire course of World War II hung by a thread so thin you could barely see it. 7 disasters that could have handed Japan the Pacific, handed them Australia, and handed them a war that we might never have recovered from. Most people have heard of Midway. Most people have heard of the great naval battles of World War II. But Guadalcanal? Guadalcanal is the forgotten war. The campaign that the history books skip over. The 6 months of absolute hell that changed everything and that almost destroyed the United States Navy before the war was even halfway through. So buckle in, because what you are about to hear is going to change the way you think about World War II forever. To understand why Guadalcanal mattered so much, you have to understand where the world stood in the summer of 1942. Just 6 months before the fighting at Guadalcanal began, the Japanese had launched their attack on Pearl Harbor and had stunned the entire world with the ferocity and the precision of their assault. In a single morning, they had crippled the American battleship fleet, killed over 2,400 American sailors, and announced to every nation on earth that Japan was a power that could not be stopped. And in the months that followed Pearl Harbor, it seemed like Japan truly could not be stopped. They swept through the Philippines. They took Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress that Churchill himself had called the key to the entire region. They drove the Dutch out of Indonesia. They pushed into Burma. They bombed Darwin on the northern coast of Australia. And with every passing week, the Japanese empire spread further and further across the Pacific like a stain that no one could contain. The American people were terrified. The American military was reeling. And the question that hung over every strategy meeting, every intelligence briefing, every conversation in Washington was simple and devastating. How do you stop them? How do you stop a military machine that seems to be winning everywhere it goes, that seems to have an answer for every move you make, and that is expanding so fast that your own positions are becoming untenable before you even have a chance to defend them? The answer, when it finally came, was audacious and risky and frankly more than a little desperate. American intelligence had detected that the Japanese were building an airstrip on a small, jungle-covered island in the Solomon Islands chain. The island was called Guadalcanal, and by itself, Guadalcanal was nothing. It was a miserable, swampy, malaria-infected patch of jungle in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing beautiful about it. There was nothing strategically obvious about it to the untrained eye. But to the military planners who understood what air power meant in modern warfare, that airstrip changed everything. Because from Guadalcanal, Japanese aircraft could reach the shipping lanes between the United States and Australia. They could interdict the supply lines that were keeping Australia in the war. They could neutralize American bases in the region. And they could use the island as a stepping stone to push even further south toward New Caledonia, toward Fiji, toward Samoa. If Japan completed that airstrip and used it to project air power across the region, Australia itself could be cut off. And Australia was not just a country. Australia was the staging ground, the supply base, the anchor point for any future American offensive in the Pacific. Lose Australia, and the war in the Pacific gets dramatically, almost impossibly harder. So the Americans had to take Guadalcanal. They had to take it before the Japanese finished that airstrip. And they had to hold it no matter what the Japanese threw at them. The operation was called Watchtower, and the Marines who were assigned to carry it out, looking at the inadequate supplies, the rushed planning, and the complete lack of reliable intelligence about the island, called it by a different name. They called it Operation Shoestring, because that is exactly what it felt like. A desperate gamble held together by nothing but courage and necessity and the thinnest possible thread of hope. On the 7th of August, 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal. 11,000 Marines hit the beaches in what was the first American offensive ground operation of the entire war. And for the first 24 hours, things actually went reasonably well. The Japanese garrison on the island was caught largely by surprise. The Marines pushed inland. They captured the unfinished airstrip. They renamed it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who had been killed at the Battle of Midway just 2 months earlier. And it seemed, for one brief, shining moment, like this might actually work. Then everything fell apart, because while the Marines were consolidating on the beach, and while the Navy was unloading supplies from the transport ships, something was happening 400 miles to the north that the Americans did not know about. Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa had assembled a Japanese cruiser force. 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 1 destroyer. He had them moving south at high speed, and he was coming to destroy the American fleet before it could properly support the Marines on the ground. What happened next would go down as one of the most catastrophic naval defeats in American history. And it would be the first of those 7 near disasters that almost cost the United States the entire campaign. The Battle of Savo Island began at 1:43 in the morning on the 9th of August, 1942, and it was over in less than 30 minutes. Mikawa's force came screaming out of the darkness using a combination of superior night fighting training, exceptional lookouts, and the deadly Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, which was arguably the finest naval torpedo in the world at that time. The Americans were caught completely off guard. The heavy cruiser Quincy was hit so hard and so fast that she rolled over and sank within minutes. The Vincennes was struck by shells and torpedoes and went down with most of her crew still trapped inside. The Astoria burned for hours before finally slipping beneath the surface the following morning. The Australian cruiser Canberra was hit so badly that she had to be scuttled by her own side because there was no way to save her. In less than 30 minutes, 4 Allied cruisers were gone. Over 1,000 men were dead. And the waters around Savo Island, which would come to be called by a name that still sends a chill down the spine of anyone who knows this history, will be called Iron Bottom Sound. Because by the time the campaign was over, the bottom of that stretch of water would be littered with the wrecks of dozens of ships and the bodies of thousands of men. And the truly remarkable thing about the Battle of Savo Island, the thing that makes your stomach drop when you read about it, is that Mikawa could have finished the job completely. He could have turned his cruisers around and destroyed the American transport ships that were still there, still unloading supplies, utterly helpless and exposed. If he had done that, if he had pressed his advantage, the Marines on Guadalcanal would have been left with no supplies, no naval support, and no way off the island. The entire operation would have collapsed in 48 hours. But Mikawa was worried about American carrier aircraft attacking him at dawn. He made the cautious decision. He withdrew, and because of that one decision, the Americans got a second chance. The first near disaster, and it would not be the last. With the Navy now pulling its ships back from Guadalcanal to avoid further losses, the Marines on the island found themselves in a situation that was rapidly becoming desperate. They had managed to get ashore roughly 60% of their supplies before the naval withdrawal. That sounds like more than enough until you understand what that actually meant in practice. It meant they were short on ammunition, short on food, short on medicine, short on barbed wire, short on sandbags, short on every single thing you need to hold a defensive perimeter against an enemy that has every intention of coming to kill you. The Marines began rationing immediately. They were eating 2 meals a day, then 1 meal a day, then whatever they could find in the jungle or would take for Japanese supply dumps. They were living in foxholes in one of the most brutal environments on the planet. Guadalcanal was not just an island. It was a living nightmare. The jungle was so thick in places that you could barely see 5 feet in front of you. The heat was absolutely crushing, the kind of wet, suffocating heat that makes every movement feel like you are wading through warm soup. The rain came in torrents and turned everything to mud. And then there were the things that the jungle put inside you. Malaria, carried by the mosquitoes that swarmed in the stagnant pools everywhere across the island. Dysentery from contaminated water. Fungal infections from the constant dampness. Scrub typhus, dengue fever. By the end of the campaign, disease would actually cause more Marine casualties than Japanese bullets. And through all of this, the Marines had to stay alert, had to stay ready, because the Japanese were not going to wait patiently for them to get comfortable. The Japanese response to the American landing on Guadalcanal was immediate and furious. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo was shocked, outraged, and completely contemptuous of the American forces. They made a catastrophic underestimation. Intelligence reports suggested that only about 2,000 American troops had landed on the island. The actual number was closer to 11,000. And so the Japanese sent in Colonel Kiyono Ichiki with just 900 men, the advance element of what was supposed to be a much larger force, with orders to attack immediately and drive the Americans into the sea. Ichiki was a proud, aggressive officer who had been involved in the Marco Polo Bridge incident in China back in 1937, the event that had triggered the full-scale Sino-Japanese War. He was supremely confident. He was contemptuous of American fighting ability. And he led his men in a night attack on the Marine perimeter along the Tenere River on the 21st of August, 1942. What happened at the Battle of the Tenere was savage and one-sided and absolutely ferocious. The Marines had been preparing their defenses for 2 weeks. They had barbed wire. They had interlocking fields of fire. They had mortars and machine guns, and they had the cold professional discipline that the United States Marine Corps is built on. Ichiki's men hit the Marine line and were cut to pieces. Literally cut to pieces. The Marines brought a light tank unit around to flank the Japanese position, and the tanks drove back and forth through the Japanese survivors, crushing them. Of the approximately 900 men in Ichiki's force, only a handful escaped alive. Ichiki himself burned his regimental colors and then killed himself rather than face the dishonor of surrender. It was a devastating Japanese defeat, but the Japanese high command did not draw the right lesson from it. Instead of reconsidering their assessment of American fighting ability, they simply concluded that Ichiki's force had been too small. They would need to send more men, and they would need to neutralize Henderson Field, because as long as American aircraft were operating from that airstrip, they could attack the Japanese ships trying to bring in reinforcements. And so began the brutal, relentless pattern that would define the next 6 months on and around Guadalcanal. The Japanese would try to bring troops and supplies in by ship. The Americans would try to stop them from the air. And at night, when the American aircraft were grounded, the Japanese Navy would come down what became known as the Slot, the passage between the Solomon Islands, to bombard Henderson Field, to sink American ships, and to land more reinforcements. This became so routine, so predictable, so grimly regular that the Marines called the Japanese night bombardment runs the Tokyo Express. Every night, every single night, the destroyers would come. The shells would fall on Henderson Field, and the men in the foxholes would press themselves into the earth and pray that the next one did not land on top of them. The second great near disaster came at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in late August of 1942. The Japanese had assembled a major fleet operation to escort a large convoy of transports carrying reinforcements for Guadalcanal. 3 carriers were involved on the Japanese side. The Americans committed their carriers Enterprise and Saratoga to intercept them. The battle was complex and confused, as carrier battles always were in this period. Aircraft flew in multiple directions. Ships maneuvered across hundreds of miles of ocean. The Japanese light carrier Ryujo was sunk. The Enterprise took 3 bomb hits and was seriously damaged, forcing her to withdraw to Pearl Harbor for repairs. And the Japanese troop convoy was turned back without landing its troops, though it would try again later. The Americans claimed a tactical victory, but the Enterprise was out of the fight, and the American carrier force in the Pacific was dangerously thin, which meant the third near disaster was already setting up. On the 31st of August, the carrier Saratoga was hit by a Japanese submarine torpedo. She survived, but she was out of action for months. Then on the 15th of September came the single worst moment of the entire campaign for the American Navy. The carrier Wasp was hit by a salvo of torpedoes from the Japanese submarine I-19. 3 of those torpedoes struck the Wasp. The resulting fires and explosions were catastrophic. The Wasp had to be abandoned and then sunk by American destroyers to prevent her from falling into Japanese hands. And in the same attack, the battleship North Carolina, the pride of the American battle fleet, was hit by another torpedo from the same submarine salvo and seriously damaged. In one terrible afternoon, the Americans had lost a carrier and a battleship to a single submarine, which meant that now, of the carriers that had been operating in the Pacific at the start of the Guadalcanal campaign, only one was left undamaged and operational. The Hornet. One carrier to defend the entire South Pacific, to support the Marines on Guadalcanal, to face whatever the Japanese Navy decided to throw at them next. If they lost the Hornet, they were done. There would be no American carrier cover for Guadalcanal. The Tokyo Express would run unopposed. Henderson Field would be destroyed, and the Marines would have no choice but to evacuate or die. This was the third near disaster, and it was about to be followed immediately by the fourth. On the 24th of October, 1942, a massive Japanese ground assault hit the Marine perimeter around Henderson Field. General Hiroyoshi Hayakite had assembled a force of over 20,000 men on Guadalcanal by this point. This was no Colonel Achiki with 900 troops. This was a serious, coordinated, multi-pronged assault designed to overwhelm the Marine defenses, capture Henderson Field, and end the American presence on the island in a single night. The attack would go down in Marine Corps history as the Battle for Henderson Field, and the man most associated with saving the airstrip that night was Sergeant Mitchell Page. Page was a machine gunner with the 7th Marines. When his entire section was either killed or wounded during the Japanese assault, Page picked up the water-cooled .30 caliber machine gun by himself, held it in his arms despite the burning heat of the barrel, and moved it from position to position, firing continuously into the Japanese attack. He was everywhere that night. He was on both flanks. He was in the center. He called in artillery. He rallied men who were wavering. And when dawn finally came, the Japanese assault had been shattered. Hundreds of Japanese bodies were in front of the Marine wire. Mitchell Page would receive the Medal of Honor for that night's work. And Henderson Field would still be in American hands when the sun came up. The fourth near disaster, survived by the courage of individual men who simply refused to break. But the Japanese were not finished, and neither were the disasters. Because even as the ground assault was being defeated, a Japanese naval force was moving down the slot to deliver what Tokyo hoped would be the killing blow. The Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, fought on the 26th of October, 1942, was the fourth major carrier engagement of the Pacific War, and it nearly broke the American Navy once and for all. The Japanese had 4 carriers against the American 2, Hornet and Enterprise. The battle was a confused, swirling fight in which both sides sent strike aircraft toward each other simultaneously. Both sides took serious damage, and the final balance sheet was catastrophic for the Americans. The Hornet was hit by bombs, by air-launched torpedoes, and then, in one of the most dramatic moments of the entire battle, by a Japanese aircraft whose pilot deliberately crashed his burning plane in her flight deck. She burned for hours. She was hit again and again as she lay dead in the water. She cannot be saved. She was sunk by Japanese destroyers. The last American carrier in the Pacific was gone. The Enterprise was damaged, but still operating. But she was alone. For a period of several weeks in late 1942, the United States Navy had exactly one operational carrier in the entire Pacific Ocean. One against the Japanese Navy, which still had multiple carriers and was determined to use them. This was, without any question, the lowest point of the American Pacific War effort. Lower than Pearl Harbor in some ways, because at Pearl Harbor, the carriers had all been at sea and had survived. Now the carriers were gone, and the Japanese knew it. This was the 5th near disaster, the one that, more than any other, came closest to actually ending the campaign in Japanese victory. What followed in the first weeks of November 1942 was the most intense period of naval combat in the entire history of the campaign, and it produced 2 of the most extraordinary naval battles ever fought. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, fought over 2 nights and 2 days from the 12th to the 15th of November, was not a single battle, but a series of overlapping engagements fought in the darkness and confusion of Iron Bottom Sound. And it began with an act of almost suicidal American bravery. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner had learned that the Japanese were planning a massive bombardment of Henderson Field, to be followed immediately by a huge reinforcement convoy that would land enough troops to overwhelm the Marine defenders once and for all. Protecting that bombardment force were the Japanese battleships Hai and Kirishima, plus 11 destroyers and cruisers. The Japanese had battleships. The Americans, in that moment, had only cruisers and destroyers. No battleships, no carriers, just Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and his small task force, ordered to get between the Japanese fleet and Henderson Field and stop them from bombarding the airstrip, no matter what the cost. What happened in Iron Bottom Sound on the night of the 13th of November, 1942, has been called the most violent naval battle in American history. 13 American ships sailed directly into a Japanese force of 14 ships, and they fought at such close range, sometimes so close that the guns could not even depress far enough to fire at each other, that the battle seemed almost medieval in its ferocity. Ships were ramming each other. Ships were firing at point-blank range in darkness, so complete that the gun flashes were blinding the crews. It was absolute chaos, terrifying and lethal, and without precedent in modern naval warfare. Callahan was killed early in the battle when his flagship San Francisco was hit by Japanese shells. Rear Admiral Norman Scott, fighting in the cruiser Atlanta, was also killed. 2 American admirals dead in a single night. The Atlanta herself was so badly damaged by friendly fire, American shells hitting her in the confusion of the night battle, that she had to be scuttled the next morning. The destroyer Barton was sunk within 8 minutes of firing her first torpedo. The destroyer Monson was hit so many times that she looked, according to survivors, like a colander, holes everywhere, burning from bow to stern. 4 American destroyers were sunk that night. 3 more were badly damaged. The cruiser Portland had her stern blown off by a torpedo and spent the rest of the night steaming helplessly in circles. But in the middle of all this carnage, all this death and fire and chaos, the Americans accomplished their mission. The Japanese battleship Hai was so badly damaged by American shell fire that she could not withdraw at speed. Dawn caught her still in the area. American aircraft from Henderson Field, the very airstrip she had come to destroy, caught her and attacked her all day long. By the evening, the Hai was gone. A Japanese battleship sunk by aircraft operating from the very airstrip that the Japanese had planned to eliminate. The symbolism could not have been more powerful, but the cost had been enormous, and the battle was not over. The night of the 14th to 15th of November brought the 6th near disaster. It brought the most dramatic reversal of fortune in the entire campaign. The Japanese were still coming. Another bombardment force was approaching Iron Bottom Sound, this time built around the battleship Kurashima, one of the most powerful warships in the Japanese fleet. And this time, the Americans had something to meet her with. Rear Admiral Willis Lee had arrived with 2 American battleships, the Washington and the South Dakota, plus 4 destroyers. The ensuing Battle of Guadalcanal, Second Naval Battle, on the night of the 14th to 15th of November, was one of the most dramatic reversals of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese were using their superior night optics and their long lance torpedoes to devastating effect. All 4 American destroyers were either sunk or put out of action within the first minutes of the battle. The South Dakota suffered a catastrophic electrical failure at the worst possible moment, losing power to almost all her weapon systems just as the Japanese were concentrating fire on her. She was hit by dozens of shells. She was burning. She appeared to be dying. And at that moment, with the Japanese fleet concentrating on the burning South Dakota, the Washington appeared out of the darkness, unseen by the Japanese, undetected. In the space of 7 minutes, Admiral Lee's Washington fired over 75 16-inch shells into the Kurashima at ranges so close that almost every one of them struck home. The Kurashima was destroyed so quickly and so completely that the Japanese could not believe what had happened. She was abandoned and scuttled. A Japanese battleship, one of the most powerful warships Japan had, destroyed in 7 minutes in the dark. The Japanese reinforcement convoy was turned back, most of it. Some transports were beached on Guadalcanal and then destroyed by American aircraft the next morning. The Japanese plan, the big final push to retake the island, had failed, and the balance of power around Guadalcanal would never be quite the same again. But even now, even after this extraordinary American victory, the campaign was not over, because the Japanese were not done fighting, and the Marines on the ground were still suffering, and the 7th near disaster was waiting in the wings. In the last days of November 1942, a Japanese destroyer force under Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka attempted to supply the Japanese troops on Guadalcanal with a novel method. Instead of using slow, vulnerable transport ships, they packed the supplies into drums, oil drums sealed to be watertight, and planned to push them overboard near the coast where Japanese troops could swim out and retrieve them. A clever solution to the problem of American air power. An American cruiser force under Rear Admiral Carleton Wright intercepted Tanaka's destroyers in what became known as the Battle of Tassafaronga. And what happened there was the 7th near disaster, and it stands as one of the most humiliating tactical defeats in American naval history. The Americans had radar. They had more ships. They had the element of surprise. They detected the Japanese force first and opened fire first. They should have won decisively. But Tanaka's destroyer captains responded with a discipline and a speed that was almost supernatural. Even as their ships were being hit, even as Tanaka's flagship was taking damage, the Japanese destroyers launched their long lance torpedoes with devastating accuracy. 4 American heavy cruisers were hit. The Northampton was sunk. The Minneapolis, New Orleans, and Pensacola were so badly damaged that they were out of action for months, in some cases years. The New Orleans lost her entire bow to a torpedo explosion. 60 feet of the front of the ship simply ceased to exist. The Minneapolis was hit twice, and her bow folded underneath her hull. These were catastrophic wounds. And the truly galling thing, the thing that made American naval officers want to put their fist through the wall, was that Tanaka had accomplished almost nothing with his supply mission. The drum drop was largely unsuccessful. Almost none of the supplies were actually recovered by Japanese troops. He had sunk an American cruiser and crippled 3 more for essentially no material gain. But the damage was done. The 7th near disaster. And now the American cruiser force around Guadalcanal was so badly depleted that for a period, the Navy simply did not have enough undamaged ships to maintain proper control of the waters around the island. Through all of this, through all 7 disasters and near disasters, through the loss of carrier after carrier and cruiser after cruiser, the Marines on Guadalcanal held. They held in conditions that would have broken most military units in the world. By late November and into December of 1942, the average Marine on Guadalcanal had lost somewhere between 15 and 20 pounds since landing on the island. They were gaunt. They were riddled with malaria and dysentery. Their uniforms were rotting off their bodies in the jungle heat. They were sleeping in foxholes with water pooling around them. They were eating food that was sometimes barely recognizable as food. And they were fighting every single night against Japanese infiltrators, against Japanese banzai attacks, against the incessant pounding of the Tokyo Express, which kept coming despite everything the American Navy did to stop it. There's a famous photograph from Guadalcanal of a Marine asleep in his foxhole, his rifle across his lap, his face so exhausted that it looks like the face of someone 20 years older than his actual age. And it captures something essential about what the men on that island endured. They were running on nothing but nerve and stubbornness and the absolute refusal to give up the ground that they had paid for with blood. General Alexander Vandegrift, the commander of the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal, was a man who understood what his men were going through because he was living it alongside them. Vandegrift had been in the Marines for 30 years. He had served in Nicaragua and Haiti and China. He had seen hard fighting before, but Guadalcanal was something different. It was something he had never encountered. The relentlessness of it, the combination of combat stress and physical privation and disease, the feeling of being completely isolated on a remote island with an enemy that would not stop coming. This was testing his men in ways that even the most grueling peacetime training could never have prepared them for. And yet they held. They held because of men like Sergeant John Basilone, who won the Medal of Honor at the same battle for Henderson Field where Mitchell Page distinguished himself, and who would later die on the beaches of Iwo Jima, still fighting for his country years later. Men like Major Robert Gaylor, a fighter pilot who shot down 11 Japanese aircraft over Guadalcanal despite being shot down himself 3 times and returning to combat each time. Men like Lewis Puller, Chesty Puller, one of the most decorated Marines in American history, who seemed to be everywhere on Guadalcanal, leading counterattacks, rallying wavering units, and maintaining a calm under fire that became almost legendary among the men who served under him. December of 1942 brought a slow, grinding shift in the balance of the campaign. American logistics were improving. New ships were arriving to replace the ones that had been lost. More aircraft were reaching Henderson Field. The pipeline of supplies and reinforcements from the United States was beginning to overwhelm the Japanese ability to interdict it. The Japanese, meanwhile, were facing a crisis that their proud military culture made almost impossible to acknowledge or address. Their troops on Guadalcanal were starving. The drum supply method had failed. The destroyer runs were being attacked with increasing effectiveness by American aircraft. Men who had been elite soldiers, veterans of the campaigns in China and Malaya and the Philippines were dying of starvation in the jungle. Japanese officers were writing in their diaries about men so weak they could not stand up, about men who had given up and simply laid down in the jungle to die, about a situation so desperate and so hopeless that even the most fanatical belief in the superiority of Japanese spirit over American material could not overcome the simple biological reality of bodies that were failing for want of food. By January of 1943, the Japanese High Command was forced to confront what had been unthinkable just 6 months earlier. They could not retake Guadalcanal. The cost of the campaign had already been staggering. They had lost 2 battleships, 1 light carrier, 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 11 destroyers, and 6 submarines. They had lost over 800 aircraft. And most devastatingly, they had lost approximately 24,000 soldiers and sailors, most of them to starvation and disease rather than to American weapons. The decision was made at the highest levels of the Japanese military. Guadalcanal would be evacuated. Operation Coup, the Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal, was executed between the 1st and the 7th of February 1943, and it was in its own way as impressive as anything the Japanese had done in the entire war. Using high-speed destroyers operating at night, the Japanese managed to lift 11,250 survivors off the beaches of Guadalcanal without the Americans understanding what was happening until it was essentially over. The Americans actually thought the destroyer runs during Operation Coup were reinforcement attempts, not evacuation runs. When they finally landed on the western end of the island, expecting to find Japanese troops to fight, they found nothing but abandoned camps, discarded equipment, and the graves of thousands of men who had died there. The Japanese were gone. Guadalcanal was finally, completely, irrevocably in American hands. On the 8th of February, 1943, 6 months and 1 day after the Marines had first landed, the campaign for Guadalcanal was declared over. The numbers are staggering when you look at them all together. The Americans lost approximately 7,000 men in the campaign, killed in action. Another 7,000 died of disease. The Japanese lost somewhere between 24 and 30,000 men, the majority to starvation and disease. In naval terms, the losses were roughly equal in tonnage, which sounds like a draw until you realize that America was producing new ships at a rate that Japan could not begin to match. Every ship Japan lost at Guadalcanal was irreplaceable in any meaningful time frame. Every ship America lost was being replaced before the battle was even over. And in the air, the disparity was even more stark. Japan lost hundreds of aircraft and, more critically, hundreds of highly trained, irreplaceable pilots over Guadalcanal. American pilot training programs were producing new aviators at a rate that seemed almost industrial in comparison. Japan had no such program. The elite naval aviators who had carried out the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had sunk the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, who had terrorized the Pacific for the first 6 months of the war, many of them were dead over the waters of Guadalcanal and the Solomons. And Japan could not replace them. Never could replace them. The consequences of that loss would be felt at every major naval battle for the rest of the Pacific War. The strategic significance of the American victory at Guadalcanal cannot be overstated. Before Guadalcanal, the Japanese had been on the offensive everywhere in the Pacific. After Guadalcanal, they would never be on the offensive again. The battle was the turning point, the hinge on which the entire war in the Pacific rotated. Before Guadalcanal, American commanders were asking how to slow the Japanese advance. After Guadalcanal, they were asking how fast they could advance themselves. The initiative had shifted permanently. The Japanese would fight with extraordinary courage and ferocity for the next 2.5 years. They would inflict tremendous casualties on American forces at Tarawa and Polilliu and Iwo Jima and dozens of other islands. But they would never again be able to dictate the tempo of the war. They would be reacting from Guadalcanal onward, not acting. And the psychological impact on both sides was profound. For the Japanese, Guadalcanal shattered the myth of invincibility that had sustained their military expansion. For the Americans, surviving those 7 near disasters, surviving the loss of all those carriers and cruisers, and the months of brutal ground fighting in the jungle, had forged something in the American military that was harder and more dangerous than what had existed before. They had faced the worst that Japan could throw at them. They had nearly been broken 7 times. And they had not broken. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, the man ultimately responsible for American naval strategy in the Pacific, later wrote about Guadalcanal in terms that give you a sense of just how close the whole thing had come to catastrophe. He noted that at several points during the campaign, the situation was so dire that he was not sure the Americans could hold on. That is a remarkable thing for a senior admiral to acknowledge. That at multiple points, he genuinely did not know if they were going to survive. And the decisions made during those moments of maximum danger, the decision to keep feeding ships in an iron-bottom sound even when the losses were becoming almost unbearable, the decision to hold Henderson Field at all costs, the decision not to abandon the Marines when everything seemed to be falling apart around them. Those decisions were not made with certainty or confidence. They were made with fear and doubt and the desperate hope that the other side would crack first. It is the nature of war at the decisive level. You do not always know you're going to win. You just keep going anyway. There are individual stories from Guadalcanal that deserve to be told and retold, because they capture something essential about the nature of the campaign. Stories like that of aviation machinist mate first class Donald Runyon, who shot down 5 Japanese aircraft in a single day over the island and became one of the first Navy aces of the war. Stories like the men of the Cactus Air Force, the ragtag collection of Marine, Navy, and Army Air Force's pilots who flew whatever aircraft could be kept operational from Henderson Field's mud and gravel surface, often flying multiple missions a day, often flying aircraft that were barely airworthy, because every Japanese aircraft that was turned away from Henderson Field was one fewer aircraft dropping bombs on the Marines in the foxholes below. The Cactus Air Force, named for Guadalcanal's radio call sign, was not a glamorous command. There were no dress uniforms in the Solomons. There were no cocktail parties for the aviators. There was mud and malaria and the constant roar of engines and the constant fear of the moment when the Japanese fighter on your tail finally found his angle of deflection. But those pilots, those young men from small towns all across America who had learned to fly in peacetime and were now fighting for their lives over a jungle island that most of them had never heard of a year earlier. Those pilots were the reason Henderson Field survived. Every time the Japanese tried to bomb it into oblivion, the Cactus Air Force went up to meet them. And more often than not, they came back. There is also the story of the Tokyo Express itself, and of the men who tried to stop it. Night after night, the American destroyers would go out into the slot to intercept the Japanese destroyer runs. Night after night, they would fight in the darkness against an enemy who was, in those early months, simply better at night fighting than they were. The Japanese had spent years training for night combat. They had superb optics. They had the long lance torpedo. And they had a tactical aggressiveness that was genuinely frightening to face. American destroyer commanders learned very quickly that you could not approach a Japanese destroyer force the way the training manuals said you should. The training manuals have been written for daylight combat, for visual signaling, for conditions that simply did not exist in Iron Bottom Sound. You had to improvise. You had to be willing to take risks that the book said you should never take. You had to be willing to close to ranges where every shot would tell, where the fighting would be brutal and close and personal, because that was the only way to neutralize the long lance torpedoes' range advantage. Some commanders figured this out. Some commanders did not get the chance to figure it out because they were killed before they could learn the lesson. The American Navy paid in blood for every tactical insight that came out of the campaign around Guadalcanal. But those insights, that painful education in how to fight the Japanese at night, in close quarters, without hesitation, would prove invaluable in every subsequent naval campaign of the Pacific War. The men who survived Guadalcanal came home changed. Some of them found it impossible to talk about what they had seen and done. Some of them would not speak about it for decades. The combination of the physical hardship, the disease, the combat stress, and the sheer relentlessness of the fighting had left marks that did not go away when the campaign was over. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a term that anyone used in 1942 or 1943. Shell shock was the term carried over from the First World War. Battle fatigue was another term the military used. But whatever you called it, it was real, and it was everywhere among the men who had endured Guadalcanal. Marines who had held the line through 7 Japanese attacks in a single night, who had watched their friends die next to them, who had gone weeks without proper sleep or proper food, who had fought in conditions of misery and fear and isolation that are almost impossible to describe adequately to someone who was not there. Those men carried the weight of Guadalcanal with them for the rest of their lives. And yet, when you read the accounts that the survivors wrote, when you listen to the recordings of the interviews that historians conducted with veterans years later, what strikes you most is not the trauma, as real and as profound as that was. What strikes you most is the pride. The fierce, unbreakable pride in what they had accomplished. The knowledge that they had been asked to do something that seemed impossible, something that nearly failed 7 times in succession, and that they had done it anyway. That they had held on when holding on seemed like it might be the worst decision possible. That they had fought in the worst conditions on the worst terrain against one of the finest military forces in the world. And that when it was finally over, it was the Japanese flag, not the American one, that was coming down. Guadalcanal changed the United States Navy too, at an institutional level. The lessons of those 6 brutal months were absorbed and built upon and turned into new doctrine and new training and new tactical approaches that made the Navy that emerged from the campaign significantly more effective than the one that had gone in. The failure to maintain adequate air searches that had led to the disaster at Savo Island. Corrected. The tendency to fight at medium range instead of closing to decisive distance at night. Corrected. The over-reliance on rigid tactical formations in fluid night combat. Corrected. The inadequate training in night fighting that had given the Japanese such an enormous early advantage. Corrected, and corrected with an urgency and a seriousness that would not have been possible without the catastrophic cost of what had happened in Iron Bottom Sound. In that sense, the ships that were lost at Savo Island, at Tassafaronga, in all the night battles of the campaign, those ships were not simply lost. They were tuition. Incredibly expensive, paid for in blood, but ultimately transformative tuition. By the time the Navy was fighting at Leyte Gulf in 1944, the night fighting deficiencies that had plagued them at Guadalcanal were largely gone. And the Japanese advantage in night combat, that tremendous tactical advantage that had cost America so dearly in the Solomons, had been erased. The air power lessons of Guadalcanal were equally significant. The campaign demonstrated, beyond any possible doubt, the central importance of land-based air power in naval warfare in the Pacific. As long as Henderson Field was operational, Japanese ships operating in its range were vulnerable. As long as Henderson Field was threatened or neutralized by bombardment, American ships were vulnerable. The entire rhythm of the naval campaign around Guadalcanal revolved around that single dirt and gravel airstrip. Every Japanese naval operation in the region had to account for it. Every American naval operation in the region depended on it. The lesson was clear, and it would be applied throughout the rest of the Pacific War. Take the airfield. Hold the airfield, because the airfield is the battle, is the pivot on which everything else turns. The victory at Guadalcanal also had enormous strategic consequences for what happened next in the Pacific. With Guadalcanal secured and Henderson Field firmly in American hands, the Americans now had a base from which to continue their drive up the Solomon Islands chain toward the major Japanese base at Rabaul in New Britain. Operation Cartwheel, the campaign to neutralize Rabaul through a combination of island hopping and strategic bombing, became possible precisely because Guadalcanal had given the Americans their foothold. And from Rabaul's neutralization, the path opened toward the Philippines, toward Formosa, toward Japan itself. The whole vast strategic architecture of the American Pacific Offensive, everything that ultimately ended the war in August of 1945, rested on the foundation that was laid at Guadalcanal. Remove Guadalcanal from the story, and the whole timeline of the Pacific War shifts dramatically. How far it shifts is impossible to say with certainty, but it is entirely plausible that without Guadalcanal, the war in the Pacific extends by months, perhaps by a year or more. And every additional month of fighting in the Pacific in 1944 or 1945 meant tens of thousands more casualties, American and Japanese. The men who held on at Guadalcanal, the men who died in Iron Bottom Sound, were not just winning a battle. They were shortening a war. Today, if you visit Guadalcanal, which is still part of the independent nation of the Solomon Islands, you can see the reminders of what happened there. Henderson Field is still there, though it is now an international airport serving a peaceful island nation. The jungle has reclaimed much of what was fought over so desperately in 1942. The foxholes and the bunkers and the gun emplacements are mostly gone, absorbed back into the earth. But in the waters of Iron Bottom Sound, just below the surface, the ships are still there. The Quincy, the Vincennes, the Astoria, the Atlanta, the Barton, the Monson, the Cushing, the Northampton, and dozens of others. American ships and Japanese ships lying on the bottom together, covered now in coral and sea life. Divers visit them. Some of them are considered war graves and are not to be disturbed. They are memorials, silent, permanent, unreachable memorials to what happened above them in those terrible months of 1942. And the water is clear and blue and warm and beautiful, which somehow makes it more affecting, not less. Because when you see photographs of those sunken ships lying on the bottom in that warm, clear water, surrounded by fish and coral and the ordinary, indifferent life of the ocean, you understand in a visceral way that the men who died there were real. They were not abstractions. They were not figures in a strategy document. They were young men, most of them who had grown up in ordinary American towns and cities, who had learned to love the things that ordinary people love, and who had ended up at the bottom of an ocean in the South Pacific because the world had made a terrible decision to go to war, and they had been sent to fight it. The story of Guadalcanal is ultimately a story about what it costs to win. Not in the abstract, not in the language of strategy and geopolitics and the balance of power, but in the most concrete, human, devastating terms. It costs ships, most of which can be replaced. It costs aircraft, which can also be replaced. It costs the irreplaceable wisdom of experienced pilots and sailors, which takes years to develop and seconds to lose. And it costs lives, young lives, tens of thousands of them, American and Japanese and Australian. Men who deserve to grow old. Men whose families waited for letters that sometimes never came. Men who are commemorated now in memorials and in history books and in documentaries and in the slowly fading memories of people who knew them, but who are mostly now forgotten, because that is the nature of time. The great battles fade. The names blur together. The individual faces disappear into the collective noun of the fallen. But the consequences, the vast, sweeping, world historical consequences of what those men did on that island and in those waters, those remain. The Pacific War was won in many places, but the foundation of the victory was poured at Guadalcanal. 7 near disasters. 7 moments when the campaign teetered on the edge. The Battle of Savo Island. The loss of Wasp and the crippling of Saratoga. The Battle of Santa Cruz and the death of the Hornet. The night assault on Henderson Field. The 2 nights of the naval battle of Guadalcanal. The disastrous American showing at Tassafaronga. Any one of them, had things gone slightly differently, slightly worse, slightly less bravely, or slightly less luckily, could have broken the American campaign and turned the Pacific War into something unrecognizable from what we know today. That is not an exaggeration. That is the sober assessment of the historians and the strategists who have studied this campaign in detail for the 80 years since it was fought. The margin was that thin. The thread was that fragile. And the men who held it together, the Marines in the foxholes and the sailors on the burning ships and the pilots in the aircraft that barely held together over the jungle. Those men deserve to be remembered, not just as heroes, which they were, but as human beings who were frightened and exhausted and sick and cold and hungry, and who found, somewhere inside themselves, the thing that kept them going when every rational calculation said that stopping made more sense. That is the deepest mystery of Guadalcanal and of warfare in general. Not the strategy or the technology or the geopolitics, but the mystery of what is inside a person that makes them hold on when holding on seems impossible. Whatever that thing is, the men of Guadalcanal had it. And because they had it, the world is different today than it would have been without them. So the next time someone asks you about the turning point of the Pacific War, the next time someone brings up Midway or the great carrier battles of 1942, remember Guadalcanal. Remember Iron Bottom Sound. Remember the 7 disasters that nearly ended the campaign before it could be won. Remember the names: Savo Island, Tenerife River, Eastern Solomons, Cape Esperance, Guadalcanal first night, Guadalcanal second night, Tassafaronga. Remember the ships at the bottom of that warm, blue water. And remember that history does not move inevitably toward the outcomes we know. It moves through the decisions and the sacrifices and the courage of individual human beings who are doing the best they can in conditions that none of us can fully imagine. Guadalcanal was not inevitable. American victory there was not guaranteed. It was earned. It was paid for. And it changed the world.